It was a quiet morning in the small riverside village, where the mist always seemed to linger longer than anywhere else. The sun hadn't yet found the courage to rise over the trees, and a thin blanket of fog hung low across the water. Near the far edge of this village stood a tiny wooden hut, weathered by years of wind and rain. That's where a little orphan girl lived, alone but not bitter. She was small for her age, with tangled brown hair that she cut herself and clothes that had been mended too many times to count. She had lost her parents years ago when a flood came down from the mountains after weeks of heavy rain. The river that now whispered gently behind her home had once roared like a monster, swallowing everything in its path. The villagers had found her sitting on a rock days later, wet, shaking, and clutching a small piece of her mother's scarf. No one knew how she had survived. Since then, she had learned to live on her own. She gathered firewood from the forest, fetched water from the river, and helped the baker and the old woman who sold herbs in exchange for bread or soup. People in the village didn't mistreat her, but they rarely spoke to her either. It wasn't cruelty, it was just how things were. Everyone was busy surviving. She had become like the air around them, present but unnoticed. Yet even though life was hard, she never lost her kindness. She would feed stray dogs, share her bread with birds, and help old villagers carry baskets even when her own arms trembled from hunger. She didn't talk much, but when she smiled, it was the kind of smile that made people stop for a second. Her days were quiet. She woke before sunrise, collected sticks and herbs, then wandered down to the river. The river was both her friend and her reminder of everything she had lost. She often sat by it, dipping her feet into the cold water, watching the ripples spread out like thoughts that never stopped moving. Sometimes she spoke softly to the water, telling it about her day or asking if her parents could hear her somewhere beyond it. One afternoon, when the sun was sinking behind the trees and painting the sky in gold and pink, she went out as usual to collect branches. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Birds were calling to each other, and the forest felt alive. But as she reached the riverbank, she stopped. She thought she heard something, faint like a soft whimper. She looked around, her eyes searching between the tall grass and the scattered stones. At first, she thought it was an animal caught in something. Then she saw movement, a small figure near the far side of the river. It was a girl, about her age, maybe a little older. Her hair was dark, her clothes torn and muddy, and she was limping badly. She tried to cross the river, but the current pushed hard against her legs. Every step seemed to hurt. The orphan girl dropped her bundle of sticks and ran closer to the water. "Wait," she called out, though she wasn't sure if the stranger could understand her. The girl looked up, frightened. She didn't answer, only tried harder to move forward, nearly falling as the water reached her knees. The orphan didn't think twice. She waded into the river, the cold biting into her skin. The stones under her feet were slippery, and the current tugged at her dress, but she kept going. When she reached the middle, she held out her hand. The limping girl hesitated, eyes wide, but then she reached back, clutching it tightly. Together, step by step, they made their way across until both collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for breath. The orphan looked at her carefully. The girl's leg was scraped and swollen. She spoke a few words in a language the orphan didn't recognize. Her voice was soft but trembling, like she was scared. The orphan smiled and said gently, "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl looked confused, but the tone in her voice must have been enough. She nodded weakly. The orphan helped her to a nearby patch of dry grass and started a small fire using the wood she carried. She took out a piece of bread wrapped in cloth and offered it to her. The limping girl hesitated again, then took it with both hands and ate slowly as if she hadn't eaten in days. The two sat there quietly, staring at the flames. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the rushing water behind them. The orphan watched her carefully, trying to figure out who she was. The girl's clothes were not from the village. They were woven differently, and she wore a necklace made of shells and beads that glimmered faintly in the firelight. The orphan pointed to herself and said her name. Then she pointed at the girl, tilting her head, asking. The girl understood and whispered something back. It sounded strange but beautiful, like the wind moving through leaves. The orphan repeated it clumsily, and the girl smiled for the first time. As night fell, the air grew colder. The orphan gave the girl her small blanket and sat close to the fire. The girl took something from her small bag, a thin bracelet made of reeds and grass tied neatly with a thread of red yarn. She held it out with both hands, gesturing for the orphan to take it. "For me?" the orphan asked softly. The girl nodded. The orphan hesitated, touched by the gesture. She put the bracelet on her wrist carefully and smiled. "Thank you," she said. The girl smiled back and spoke a few words she didn't understand. Then she pointed toward the mountains beyond the trees, trying to explain something. The orphan could only guess she came from somewhere far away, maybe on the other side of the river. They stayed by the fire until the stars came out. The orphan could see that the girl was struggling to keep her eyes open. Her leg hurt badly, but she didn't complain. She looked fragile, like she had been through something painful. The orphan wished she could ask what had happened, but words weren't enough. Instead, she pulled the blanket higher over the girl's shoulders and whispered, "You can rest now. I'll keep watch." The night was quiet except for the soft song of crickets. The orphan sat near the fire, staring at the stars, thinking how strange life was. A few hours ago, she had been alone again, like always. Now someone was sleeping beside her, a stranger, but it didn't feel that way. When dawn started to touch the horizon, the girl stirred. The fire had died down and mist had returned to the river. The orphan helped her stand, but her leg still hurt. The girl pointed to the far bank where the forest grew thicker. She wanted to go home. The orphan knew the current would be strong in the morning, but she couldn't let the girl go alone. She nodded, helped her gather her small bag, and together they stepped into the cold water. The river rushed around them higher than before, but the orphan held her tightly. Step by step they crossed. The orphan felt her legs burn with effort, but she didn't stop until they reached the other side. When they finally stood on solid ground, the girl turned around, her eyes filled with tears. She said something in her language again, and though the orphan didn't understand the words, she could feel what they meant: gratitude, friendship, promise. The girl took one last look at her, then disappeared into the forest beyond the river. The orphan stood there for a long time, her feet sinking into the wet earth, watching until the trees swallowed her completely. She walked back home as the sun rose, tired but strangely peaceful. The bracelet on her wrist caught the morning light, glowing faintly like gold. She didn't know who that girl was or where she came from, but something told her their paths had crossed for a reason. That night, as she sat alone by her little window, she looked out toward the river. The wind whispered through the trees, and she thought she heard a faint sound, almost like a voice carried by the water. She smiled and whispered back, "Good night, my friend." She didn't know that this small act of kindness, this simple moment by the river, would change her life forever. The world around her seemed quiet again, but something unseen had already begun to move. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a message was being carried home, a story about a little orphan girl who had helped a stranger cross a river. And soon, that story would come back to her in ways she could never have imagined. The days after that strange meeting passed quietly, almost too quietly. The little orphan went back to her routine, fetching water, gathering sticks, helping old villagers with chores. But something inside her had changed. She thought often about the girl she had helped to cross the river, the way her dark eyes had softened before she disappeared into the trees, the way her small bracelet now rested on her own wrist. She found herself staring at it often, tracing the red thread with her thumb, wondering if the girl was safe. The river looked the same as always, calm on the surface, moving fast underneath. But it no longer felt lonely. Whenever the orphan went near it, she felt as though someone was watching kindly from the other side. Sometimes, when the wind blew softly, she thought she could hear faint singing carried by the water, soft and distant, like a lullaby she couldn't understand. A week later, something unusual happened. When she woke up one morning and stepped outside her hut, she found a small bundle lying near her doorstep. It was wrapped in dried leaves, tied neatly with a vine. Inside were 2 pieces of roasted fish and a few wild berries. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. She thought maybe someone in the village had left it, though no one ever gave her food like that before. The fish was still warm, and the smell made her stomach ache with hunger. She ate slowly, still glancing toward the forest as if expecting someone to appear. That same evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, she went down to the river again. The water glowed orange and pink, and dragonflies darted over the surface. She sat on her usual rock and dipped her feet into the water. After a while, she saw something shiny caught between 2 stones, a small carved figure made from wood. It was shaped like a bird with outstretched wings. She picked it up and turned it in her hands. Someone had left it there. Maybe it was the limping girl, or maybe it was just coincidence. Still, something about it felt meaningful. She smiled faintly and tucked it into her pocket. That night, she placed the little bird figure beside her window next to the bracelet. Somehow, having both there made her hut feel less empty. The next few days were peaceful but strange. She started noticing things she hadn't before. Footprints near the riverbank that didn't belong to any villager. Faint markings on the trees that looked like symbols, and once, the sound of a flute coming from deep within the forest. When she told the old woman who sold herbs, the woman frowned and said, "Don't wander too far from the village, child. The forest belongs to others." The orphan didn't argue. She nodded politely, but she couldn't stop going to the river. Something about that place made her feel connected, to her parents, to the girl, and even to herself. It was where she felt seen. One evening, as she sat near the water, she heard something behind her. She turned quickly and froze. Standing just a few steps away was a man, tall, dressed in animal skins with long hair tied behind his head. His face was painted with faint lines, and he carried a bow across his shoulder. For a moment, the orphan couldn't move, but the man didn't look angry. His expression was calm, though serious. He pointed toward the bracelet on her wrist, then to the river, and said something in a language she couldn't understand. His voice was low, steady. She shook her head slightly, trying to tell him she didn't know what he was saying. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly as if realizing she meant no harm. From his pocket, he took out a small pouch made of leather and placed it gently on the ground before her. Then he pointed to the sky, to the setting sun, and walked back toward the forest, disappearing among the trees. She waited a long time before touching the pouch. Inside were dried herbs and a small piece of fabric neatly folded. The fabric had patterns she had never seen before, colorful lines and small hand-stitched symbols. She didn't know what it meant, but she sensed it was a gift. That night, she lay awake for a long time, staring at the pouch beside her bed. She didn't understand what was happening, but something deep inside told her she had become part of something bigger than she could see. Over the next few days, the weather started to change. The wind grew colder, and clouds gathered often over the river. Villagers whispered about signs in the forest, drumbeats at night, strange lights flickering among the trees, and shadows moving silently across the hills. The orphan heard them talk at the well one morning. "They're back," one man said, his voice low. "The river people." "Maybe they're angry again," another replied. "It's been years since they came this close." "Better not go near the river," said an older woman. "They guard their land like spirits." The orphan listened quietly, her heart thumping. She wanted to tell them she had met one of them, a girl her age who had been hurt and alone, but she stayed silent. She was afraid they wouldn't believe her. Or worse, they might blame her. That night, when everyone was asleep, she went out again. The air was cold and the sky was full of stars. The forest across the river was dark, but she thought she saw a flicker of light, like a torch moving slowly between the trees. She took a step forward, her bare feet brushing against the wet grass, and whispered into the night, "Are you there?" No one answered, but the river rippled softly, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow move on the opposite bank. She stayed there until the light disappeared, then walked back to her hut, clutching her blanket tightly. The next morning, she found something new near her door. This time it wasn't food or a carving. It was a totem made of sticks and feathers, tied together carefully with thin strands of red thread. She recognized the color. It was the same red as the thread in her bracelet. She picked it up gently, unsure what it meant. Later that day, a traveler passed through the village. An old man with a walking stick and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything. He stopped by her hut to rest, and when he saw the totem, his eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "It was just there," she said. "By my door." The old man looked thoughtful for a long time, then said, "That's a sign of protection. The river people leave these for those they honor." She blinked, unsure what to say. "Protection?" He nodded slowly. "You must have done something kind, something good. They don't give these lightly." After he left, she sat quietly by the fire, staring at the totem. The flames flickered, making the feathers shimmer. A feeling of warmth spread through her chest, though she didn't fully understand why. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the limping girl again, the one she had helped cross the river. Maybe she had sent all these things. Maybe her family knew. But if they knew, why did she feel like something bigger was coming? The next few nights, she began to hear the sounds others talked about. The deep rhythmic beats of drums echoed faintly across the hills carried by the wind. At first she thought it was thunder, but the pattern was too steady, too alive. The villagers grew uneasy. Doors stayed shut after sunset and fires were kept small. People whispered that the river people were preparing for something, though no one knew what. The orphan tried not to be afraid. She told herself they wouldn't hurt her. Still, every sound made her heart jump. She would lie awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, her hand resting over the bracelet as if it could somehow protect her. One evening, she went to the river again. The air was heavy, and the water reflected the pale light of the moon. She stood there for a long time, feeling the cool wind brush her face. "Are you out there?" she whispered. "Are you safe?" Only the sound of the water replied. As she turned to go home, she noticed something on the opposite bank. There, standing among the trees, was a single figure. It was hard to see clearly in the moonlight, but she knew the way the person stood. It was the girl she had helped. The girl lifted her hand slowly, palm facing forward. The orphan froze. Then she lifted her own hand in return. No words were spoken. The moment lasted only seconds before the figure turned and vanished into the forest again. The orphan stood still, her heart beating fast, a strange calmness settling over her. She didn't know why, but she felt certain something important was about to happen, something that would bring the two worlds together again. And she was right. By the time the next dawn came, the first signs of that change had already begun. The forest was no longer quiet. The birds didn't sing that morning. Even the river seemed to flow slower, as if holding its breath. The orphan didn't know it yet, but the next sunrise would bring 30 warriors to her gate. The next few days were filled with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made even the birds go quiet. The little orphan could feel it everywhere, in the air, in the way people walked faster through the village, and in the heavy silence that hung over the river. She had grown used to being alone, but now that silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting for something. Each night, faint drum beats echoed through the forest. They came from far away, yet they filled the air as if the ground itself was humming. The villagers whispered that the river people were gathering again. Some said it was for war. Others believed it was for a ceremony. No one knew the truth. The orphan kept quiet, pretending she didn't hear. But deep down, she knew it had something to do with the girl she had helped. She couldn't stop thinking about the night she had seen the girl again, the way she had lifted her hand across the river, silent but full of meaning. That single moment had been enough to remind her that kindness, no matter how small, could travel farther than anyone could imagine. But even so, a strange worry grew in her heart. One afternoon, while she was returning from the forest with a basket of herbs, she saw a group of men from the village gathered near the river. They were pointing at footprints by the water, deep, clear marks that didn't belong to anyone from town. "They've been watching us," one man said. "Last night I saw fires across the river." "They'll come closer soon," said another, his voice sharp with fear. "We should warn everyone." The orphan stopped a few steps away, listening. She knew those footprints probably belonged to the same people who had left gifts at her door, the same ones who had sent her the totem and the bird carving. She wanted to say something, but her throat tightened. If she told them she had met one of the river people, they might not understand. They might think she brought danger to their door. So she said nothing. That night, the wind carried a different sound, not drums, but a low, haunting hum that rose and fell like waves. It made her shiver, though she couldn't say why. She sat near the small fire in her hut, clutching the bracelet on her wrist, feeling the thin threads between her fingers. Then, faintly, she heard something outside. She stood up slowly, heart beating fast. When she opened the door, the air was cold and still. Moonlight spread across the grass, making everything look silver. She looked toward the river and froze. On the far bank stood 3 tall figures. They weren't moving. Their faces were hidden by shadows, but the moonlight glinted off their clothing, made from leather and beads. They stood silently, watching her hut, her breath caught. For a long moment, neither side moved. Then one of them stepped forward and raised a hand slowly, palm outward, the same way the limping girl had done that night. The orphan hesitated, then lifted her hand in return. The figure lowered his hand and bowed his head slightly. Then all three turned and disappeared into the trees. She stayed there long after they were gone, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't feel fear, not exactly. It was something else, something she couldn't name. The next morning she told no one. But the signs continued to appear. A small bundle of herbs was left at her door. Then a ring made of braided grass. Once she found a white feather tied to her gate with a red string. Every gift felt like a message, though she didn't understand the words. One afternoon, while she was washing clothes by the river, an old man from the village stopped beside her. He was one of the few who spoke kindly to her sometimes. His eyes were gentle but tired. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said quietly, glancing at the forest. "Strange things are happening. You've heard the drums, haven't you?" She nodded slightly. He sighed. "I was a boy when they last came this close. People were frightened then too, but they didn't come to harm us, not until we gave them reason to. Fear makes people do foolish things." He looked at her wrist and noticed the bracelet. His eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not from here, is it?" She shook her head. He didn't ask more. After a pause, he said softly, "Keep it safe. Sometimes the smallest gifts carry great meaning." That evening, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. She sat outside her hut long after sunset, the sky above full of quiet stars. The world around her felt like it was holding its breath. She whispered to herself, "Maybe something good will come from all this." But the villagers didn't feel the same. Fear was spreading faster than truth. By the next morning, word had gone around that someone in the village was being watched by the river people. Some said it was a curse. Others said it was a warning. When she walked through the marketplace, people looked at her differently. Some turned away. Some whispered. She tried not to let it show, but it hurt. She had done nothing wrong. As the days passed, the tension grew. Dogs barked at night for no reason. The air smelled of smoke from fires burning across the river. Then one night something happened that changed everything. It was near midnight when she woke to the sound of footsteps outside her hut. Soft, careful steps. She sat up slowly, holding her breath. The fire had burned low, casting faint light on the walls. There was a quiet tap on her door. Once, then twice. Her hands trembled as she reached for the latch. When she opened the door, the night air rushed in, cool and sharp. Standing there was the same limping girl. Her hair was tied back, her clothes cleaner now, but she still had that gentle look in her eyes. The orphan gasped softly, covering her mouth. The girl smiled faintly and spoke a few words in her language. The orphan didn't understand, but she felt the warmth in her tone. Without thinking, she stepped forward and hugged her. The girl tensed for a moment, then hugged her back. When they pulled apart, the girl held out something wrapped in cloth, a small carved stone with markings on it. She placed it in the orphan's hands and pointed to the forest beyond the river. The orphan frowned, trying to understand. The girl seemed to be warning her, motioning for her to stay inside. Then she pressed her palm to the orphan's cheek gently, her eyes full of meaning. Before the orphan could say anything, the girl turned and vanished into the mist. The orphan stood in the doorway for a long time, clutching the stone tightly. The rest of the night was quiet. Too quiet. When dawn began to break, the world outside felt heavy. The sky was pale gray and a faint fog rolled across the ground. The village was still asleep, unaware of what was coming. The orphan stepped outside, feeling uneasy. She looked toward the river and her breath caught. There was smoke rising from the trees. Not the kind from fires of destruction, but ceremonial smoke, white and spiraling upward. And faintly through the mist she could see movement. Figures, many of them, her heart pounded. They were crossing the river one by one, their reflections shimmering on the surface. The air filled with the low rhythm of drums, slow, steady, echoing deep into the ground. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the grass, she could see them clearly. Men in traditional garments, faces marked with paint, carrying spears and decorated staffs. They moved with calm and purpose, not like invaders, but like people following a ritual. The orphan froze where she stood, unable to speak or move. The 30 warriors reached the far edge of the village and stopped. They didn't shout or raise their weapons. They simply stood there, lined in silence, the rising sun glinting off their painted faces. Then the largest among them, tall, proud, with gray streaks in his hair, stepped forward slowly. He was holding something in his hand. Even from a distance, the orphan recognized it. The river reed bracelet she had once been given. Her knees felt weak. She took a step back, her eyes wide. Why were they here? What did they want? The villagers, awakened by the sound of drums, began to come out of their homes one by one. Gasps filled the air. Mothers pulled their children close. Men whispered nervously. But the warriors did not move closer. They simply stood, their eyes fixed on the little hut by the edge of the village. Her hut. The orphan's heart thudded as she clutched the stone the limping girl had given her only hours before. Whatever was happening, she knew this moment wasn't about fear. It was about something else. Something that began the day she had helped a stranger cross the river. And now, as dawn painted the world in gold, she realized that act of kindness had not been forgotten. What she didn't yet know was that this sunrise would bring the truth and change her life forever. The wind carried a strange sound that night. It wasn't like the usual whisper of trees or the hooting of owls. It was deeper, like a drum beat that came from far away, slow and steady, echoing through the valley. The orphan girl sat inside her little hut, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She could feel something stirring in the air, something she didn't understand. She looked toward the small wooden window. The moonlight fell on the small totem she kept near her bed. It was the one she had found near her door a few days ago. The carved figure with soft lines and strange marks. The traveler who passed through had told her it was a mark of protection. She had believed him, but tonight she didn't know if it was protecting her or warning her. The villagers were uneasy. They had been whispering all day about the sounds coming from beyond the forest. Some said they were hearing drums at night. Others said they saw lights moving between the trees. By evening, the fear had spread across every house. Doors were locked early. Fires burned low. Even the dogs that usually barked through the night were quiet. The orphan sat by her small fire, stirring the pot of thin soup she had made from wild herbs. Her stomach growled softly, but she wasn't hungry. Her thoughts kept wandering back to the girl she had helped by the river, the one with the limp. She could still remember her face, the way she had clung to her for balance, the way her eyes had filled with tears when she reached the other side. She hadn't seen her since, and though she told herself she did the right thing, she couldn't shake off the worry that maybe she had done something forbidden. What if the villagers found out? What if helping the strange girl had brought trouble to the town? A sudden knock at her door made her jump. Her heart raced. She froze, holding her breath. Nobody ever came to her house at night. The knock came again, softer this time. She stood up slowly, her bare feet brushing against the cold dirt floor. "Who's there?" she asked in a trembling voice. There was no reply. Only silence. Then from outside she heard an old man's voice. "Child, it's me. Open the door." It was the elder who sometimes visited the village. He was the one who had told her about the totem. She quickly opened the door. The old man stood there, wrapped in a heavy cloak, his face lined and tired. "I saw lights in the forest," he said quietly, glancing around. "They're coming closer." "Who?" she asked. He looked at her with serious eyes. "The river people. They're moving through the woods." The orphan felt her knees weaken. "Are they angry?" she whispered. The old man didn't answer immediately. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "No one knows yet," he said finally. "But the villagers are frightened. Some say they're preparing to fight. Others are hiding their families in the barn. You should stay here and not step out until morning." She nodded. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said softly. "I only helped a girl. She was hurt." The old man looked at her for a long moment. "Sometimes kindness travels farther than we can imagine," he said. "Go to bed, child. Keep the fire burning." Then he left into the dark, his cloak disappearing into the wind. The orphan sat down again, her hands shaking. The sound of drums was clearer now, distant but steady. Boom, 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 like a heartbeat in the earth. The night felt heavy. Every shadow seemed alive. Hours passed. The drums stopped for a while, then started again, faster, louder. The villagers began shouting from their homes. Someone rang a metal bell in panic. She could hear footsteps outside, people running, doors slamming, her chest tightened with fear. She ran to her window and peeked out. The sky had turned gray-blue, the first hint of dawn creeping in. In the dim light, she saw figures moving along the distant riverbank. Dark shapes, many of them walking together. The villagers were gathered near the center of the town, whispering and pointing. Some carried tools, others held torches. But no one dared to cross the open space near the forest. She watched quietly, her breath fogging the glass. Something deep inside told her not to hide. Instead, she opened her door and stepped outside, the cold air biting her skin. She walked slowly toward the wooden gate that marked the front of her small yard. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The air smelled of smoke and wet soil. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then from the mist rising off the river they appeared. The first man she saw rode a horse tall and strong. His face was painted with lines of dark color, his eyes sharp but calm. Behind him came others, men and women, some walking, some on horses. They moved with quiet strength, not shouting or running. They were steady, proud, and together. The villagers gasped and backed away. Some dropped what they were holding. The orphan didn't move. She stood at her small gate, frozen, her bare feet pressing into the cold dirt. The leader rode forward until he was only a few feet away from her fence. He didn't speak. His eyes searched her face, then looked toward her small home, then down at the totem lying near her window. He turned to the others behind him and raised his hand. The rest stopped. Then the leader dismounted slowly. From behind him, 2 riders came forward. One of them carried something wrapped in a cloth. The other, smaller and walking with a slight limp, stepped forward beside the horse. The orphan's eyes widened. She knew that face, the limp, the gentle eyes. It was her. The same girl she had helped across the river. The native girl smiled weakly, her hair longer now, her face healed. She held the orphan's old scarf in her hand, the one the orphan had wrapped around her shoulders that night to keep her warm. The leader looked at the girl, then at the orphan, then spoke in a voice deep and calm. She didn't understand his words, but the girl stepped forward and translated softly. He says, "The daughter of his people came home because of you." Tears filled the orphan's eyes. She shook her head, unable to speak. "I only helped her," she whispered. The girl translated again, then smiled. He says, "That is why they came. To help you now." The orphan didn't understand what that meant at first. But when she looked around, she saw the 30 warriors standing there, all of them lowering their spears and bowing their heads in silence. The villagers who had been watching from a distance were speechless. Some even dropped to their knees, realizing this wasn't an attack. It was something else, something sacred. The leader raised his hand again. A few of the warriors stepped forward and placed bundles of food, firewood, and cloth near the orphan's gate. Then one by one they bowed and stepped back. The girl limped closer, her voice trembling. "You helped me cross the river when I was weak," she said. "Now we cross it for you. You will never be alone again." The orphan couldn't hold her tears anymore. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly. The girl reached out and hugged her tightly. The warmth of that moment melted all the cold from the air. The leader spoke again, and the girl translated one last time. He says, "Your kindness is now written in our hearts. The river remembers." The sun finally rose over the hills, lighting up the mist and painting the world in gold. The orphan's small home looked almost magical under the morning light, surrounded by quiet warriors standing with respect. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like a poor orphan anymore. She felt seen. The warriors stood silently until the sun climbed higher. Then, without another word, they turned and walked back toward the river. The girl looked back once, smiling, before disappearing with her people into the forest. The villagers slowly came out from hiding. None of them spoke. They only stared at the little orphan standing at her gate, tears still shining on her cheeks, the morning light behind her. From that day on, everyone in the village knew. The small house by the river wasn't just a home for a lonely girl anymore. It was a place of honor, a place where kindness had once crossed the river and brought peace to both sides. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet village by the river slowly returned to its calm rhythm. The fields bloomed again. The air smelled of fresh grass, and the sound of birds filled the mornings. But inside the little orphan's heart, everything felt different now. She still woke before sunrise every day, just as she used to, but her steps had more meaning now. She would carry her small basket to the riverbank, not to fetch water this time, but just to sit by the shore and watch the current move. The pendant the warriors had given her hung close to her heart, shining softly whenever sunlight touched it. Sometimes she would touch it gently, as if she could still feel the presence of the limping girl on the other side of the water. The villagers had begun treating her differently, too. People who once ignored her now greeted her kindly. Some even smiled at her, asking if she needed anything. A few children from the village had started visiting her, curious about the day the warriors came. They would sit by her door, wide-eyed, as she told them small parts of the story, never bragging, never trying to make it sound grand, but always simple and full of feeling. She would say, "It wasn't bravery. It was just kindness. Anyone can do it." But deep down she knew that the moment she stepped into that cold river had changed everything, not only for the limping girl she saved, but for herself too. One morning, as she sat by the river with her basket beside her, she noticed something different. A small wooden carving floated gently toward her. She stood up, waded into the shallow water, and picked it up. It was shaped like a bird, smooth and light with tiny beads tied around its neck. She held it close and smiled. It could only have come from the forest beyond the river. She sat down again, holding the carving in her hands. "So you haven't forgotten me," she whispered. Over the next few weeks, she found more small signs like that. Sometimes a string of colored beads, sometimes a bunch of herbs tied with bark. Once, she even found a small pouch filled with river stones painted in bright colors. She knew these were gifts, quiet messages from the limping girl and her people, sent through the river that had once brought them together. It made her feel watched over, protected and connected to something far bigger than the little village she lived in. But life, as always, had its turns. One evening, the clouds began to darken. Thunder rolled across the sky and the wind started to rise. The villagers hurried to bring in their livestock and close their shutters. The orphan quickly gathered her few things and placed them inside her hut. By nightfall, heavy rain began to pour, and the river swelled with roaring water. She sat by her small fire, hugging her knees as the wind howled outside. The sound of the storm was frightening, louder than anything she had heard in a long time. The roof creaked and the walls trembled slightly. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Please hold, just hold a little longer." By morning, the rain had stopped, but the river had changed. Its calm surface was gone, replaced by swirling brown water filled with fallen branches and debris. The bridge that connected the two sides of the river had been completely washed away. The orphan stood there, heart sinking, knowing that the path to the forest and to her friend had been broken. She wanted to cry but held back her tears. The limping girl's words came to her mind. "The river ties us together. If the river had connected them once, it could do so again." She refused to believe the bond was gone. Over the next few days, the orphan helped the villagers rebuild what the storm had damaged. She worked tirelessly, carrying wood, mending fences, and sharing food with those who lost their crops. Though she was small, her determination inspired others. Even the older men in the village who had once looked down on her began to nod with respect when they passed her by. One evening, as she rested near the river, she saw something that made her heart jump, a faint trail of smoke rising from across the water. It was far away, but she knew what it meant. They were still there. Her friend and her people had survived the storm too. She smiled and whispered, "I knew it." Days went by, and the orphan kept visiting the river every dawn, hoping for a sign. One morning she found it, a bundle wrapped in cloth floating gently toward her side. Inside she found dried meat, some herbs, and a new wooden carving of two hands joined together. It was their way of saying, "We're still with you." She laughed softly through her tears and looked toward the forest. "I'm still here too," she whispered, "and I'll never forget." Time continued to move forward, and the little orphan began to grow. Seasons changed. Summer melted into autumn, and the leaves turned golden by the water's edge. The pendant she wore never left her neck, even as she grew taller and stronger. The villagers soon began to notice how she cared for others, tending to the sick, feeding the hungry, and comforting children who cried. Some even began to say she had a kind of quiet wisdom, something beyond her years. One evening, an elder from the village came to her hut. He sat by her small fire and said, "Child, we have watched you since that morning when the warriors came. You are young, but your heart is large. You have brought peace where there was once fear. If you are willing, we want you to help guide our people." She blinked in surprise. "Guide them? Me?" The old man smiled. "Yes, not as a leader of words, but as one of spirit. You remind us of what kindness can do." She didn't know what to say. She had always been the one who followed, who listened, who worked quietly in the background. But something inside her told her this was what she was meant to do. From that day forward, she began helping the elders in small ways, teaching the children to be kind, helping families find peace after arguments, and reminding everyone that the smallest good deed could change everything. People began to look up to her not because of her age or strength, but because of her heart. Years passed, and though she had grown into a young woman, she still visited the river every morning. One dawn, as mist covered the water, she saw movement on the far side. A small group of figures stood there, tall, familiar, and still. Her heart raced. She stepped closer, her eyes straining through the fog. And then she saw her, the limping girl, older now too, standing at the edge of the forest with a gentle smile. Without thinking, the orphan waved both her hands in the air, tears already streaming down her face. The limping girl raised her hand too, holding something shining like a pendant just like hers. For a long moment they stood there silently, separated by the wide river but bound by something far stronger. The sun rose higher, painting the water in gold. The fog slowly lifted, and the limping girl placed her hand over her heart in a gesture of love and respect. The orphan did the same. They didn't need to speak. The river carried their message between them, a message that said, "We are family still." As the years went on, the orphan, no longer an orphan in spirit, became known across the valley for her kindness and wisdom. Travelers who passed through the village often stopped by her hut, leaving small gifts or asking for her guidance. And every time someone thanked her, she would smile and say, "I only did what anyone should do." But deep down, she always remembered that cold morning by the river, when everything began, the day she reached out her hand to help a stranger and ended up finding a family she never knew she had. And though life moved forward, the bond she shared with the people beyond the forest never faded. Sometimes she would wake before dawn, walk down to the river and sit there as the mist rolled across the water. The air would be still, the world quiet, and she would whisper softly, "I'm still here." And if you listened closely enough, you might hear a faint echo coming back from the other side, carried by the wind, shaped by the trees, whispering back, "So are we." That river, once wild and dangerous, had become something sacred, a bridge between two hearts, two worlds, and two stories that began with nothing more than an act of kindness. And so, at dawn, when light kissed the horizon and the earth woke up again, the little orphan who once had no one would stand by her door, smiling at the sun, her spirit strong and peaceful. She was no longer alone. She had become a part of something timeless, proof that one kind heart can change the world, one hand stretched across the river at a time.